Hello, everyone. Welcome to this third session of data reuse with Power BI. We have been looking at this important topic of reusing data in Power BI, which has many advantages, avoiding redundant work, for instance, or gaining on productivity. And in previous sessions, we talked about those benefits and some of the common mistakes that come with trying to use data reuse. Even though Power BI is a very good platform that is specifically designed for facilitating data reuse, there are some mistakes that you can easily make, and we covered those in our previous webinar. Today, we are going to focus on best practices when tackling data reuse. Again, welcome. My name is Jean-Luc Coquerels, and as CEO of Centrix, I have the privilege of leading an excellent team of BI professionals, and we help hospitals make the best use of their data. And Lars Kenman is going to be doing the presentation today. Lars, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, thank you, Jean-Luc. As Jean-Luc said, I'm Lars Kenman. I'm a principal solutions architect with Centrix, and we work on data architecture, data strategy with Power BI, and topics like governance, information security. And what we're going to talk about today really has to do with something that I've always been passionate about, which is this idea of how data flows through systems. And so my background is in distributed system design, initially on the software side of things. I've been working with the Microsoft Cloud since the beta of Azure in 2009. And so today we will look at what that can look like for an organization in Power BI and how to do that well. All right, let's jump over to today's section. Sorry, bear with me. There's quite a few slides to skip past from previous webinars. And try it this other way. Okay, so as Jean-Luc said, we are talking today about best practices for data reuse in Power BI. And the question that you might have is how this relates to the previous webinars that we talked about. The first webinar we did was really aimed at demos of how self-service works in Power BI. So the benefits of reusing data assets from a self-service perspective. If you haven't watched that webinar, please go back after this one and take a look at it. It will give you some helpful context for all the different capabilities of the platform that we talk about today. Then in the most recent webinar that we did, the 7 costly mistakes of data reuse, that one was really focused on topics that a data engineer would need to know when working with Power BI. So in that webinar, we talked about things that can go wrong and how to avoid those mistakes. And today we are really looking at the audience of strategists, leaders. If you are trying to implement a data reuse strategy in your organization, we today are going to be talking about the strategic things that you need to do to make that happen, to get from the simple canned demos that Microsoft might provide to how you actually implement something coherent and meaningful across an entire organization. So what do we mean by data reuse? As a very quick recap, well, when we traditionally develop reports for customers in our organization or even outside of our organization, typically you have a single data use that people are asking for. And so the data set that you build in Power BI is really almost viewed as a means to an end to get the data from the data source into Power BI so you can build the visuals that someone is asking for. And what we want to do instead is to empower the teams within our organizations to build these reusable data assets that not only serve the report that was being asked for, but also can unlock new data uses that maybe weren't even imagined when that first request came in. So data reuse means the organization can leverage existing data assets to generate new insights and get a bigger return on investment. And this slide we discussed in the previous webinar in much more detail, so we won't go through this here, but a key takeaway is that, as Jean-Luc mentioned, Power BI is designed to be a comprehensive platform for data reuse. It is not designed, first and foremost, as a platform to just host reports, like the old SQL Server reporting services or Crystal reports, things like that. And so it requires you to change the way that you work. Unfortunately, with all of those capabilities come many opportunities for mistakes. So in the last webinar, we had looked at 7 pitfalls of data reuse to be aware of in Power BI. Now you might be wondering, are we just going to talk about the things to fix those pitfalls in this webinar on best practices? But we're actually after something much more strategic today. So the previous webinar was very tactical, again, aimed at data engineers. Today, we are talking about as leaders, as strategists, how can we transform our organization? So the question is, if we want our organization to build these reusable data assets, how do we navigate that? This is the current home screen in the Power BI service. And as you may or may not know, Power BI, well, it has evolved a lot over the years, but the home screen especially has gone through a lot of changes, a lot of iteration, different ways that the product team at Microsoft has tried to make this screen efficient and effective. But for most organizations, the reality is your assets, your data assets in Power BI are still chaotic. And as a result, people tend to use this screen primarily to just fall back on what is familiar to them. That's why, for example, it might be a little hard to see here with the screenshot, but the very first thing that's prioritized for people is the recent things that they have worked with before. There's not really much discovery of other things happening here. Even in this recommended section, the recommendations, unless you're looking at templates that Microsoft is providing, they're really prioritizing what you most recently worked on. And so there's not a whole lot of capability for the types of things that we're trying to instill in an organization, which is giving people the confidence and the ability to explore the data assets that are available in their organization. So today we are going to talk about not so much the happy path of the quick product demos. We're after a deliberate set of choices that you can make as a leader to help your organization navigate what it takes to get to a self-service vision. So what does this look like outside of business intelligence? What does reuse look like in the real world? A good analogy, and I credit Jean-Luc for this one as an industrial engineer. The idea of an assembly plant, a car manufacturing plant, for example. Nowadays, factories are not like the early kind of idyllic concept that you might have heard of with the Ford Model T plant, where raw material comes in at one end of a factory and the finished car comes out at the other end. Today, we have, thanks to modernization, thanks to globalization, you have really concentric rings of suppliers. You have the tier 1 suppliers that are providing, key components of the car, pieces of the chassis, the engine. Then you have tier 2 suppliers, which are maybe providing components that are still specifically designed for that car, things like the door handle or the, the entertainment system, but they can also be more easily repurposed for other cars. And other vehicles. And then you have tier 3, which at that point you're talking about screws and bolts and plastic fasteners to hold cables together. Those types of things are very easily reused in any number of products that don't even have to do with transportation potentially. So all of these things are pre-assembled to deliver together. There's a supply chain that facilitates the transportation of these things and the discovery of these things. And so there's a global marketplace to discover components that you might want to work with. So data reuse is very much like an assembly line, where if we think of each step in the process as not a vendor or a manufacturer, but as a data engineer or as an analyst, you can start to think about how data flows through your organization. So at Centrix, we've seen that this model works well in real life. This idea of having data flowing through an organization as products. But before we look at how we specifically do that in Power BI and give you the list of the best practices to take away from this webinar, we want to just take a look at a bit of theory that explains why this works. Why is this approach, this supply chain approach, this data reuse approach, why is this effective? Why does this work in information organizations that don't seem to look very much like manufacturing potentially? So this theory comes from the concept of a data mesh. This was first proposed by a data architecture consultant named Zhamak Dehghani in 2019. She initially had written a series of blog posts about this, later published a book on data mesh, I highly recommend it if you want to go deep into the theory of how this works. For today, we're just going to look at a couple of key takeaways and how they map directly to things that we can do in Power BI. Now, for those of you who have heard of data mesh before, you might think that it's only for very mature organizations or only applies to, cutting edge, whatever high-tech organizations, maybe not what you might think of as describing your particular company or organization. But the reality is, as we talked about before with this idea of the supply chain, your organization is already working as a data mesh. The reality is you just don't realize it, and that's why it's not working very well. Every organization has pockets where data is being produced for other parts of the organization, but without the right tools and processes and an overall structure to guide that, it's chaotic and it's frustrating. And typically people fall back on the central BI team, which is the bottleneck for everything, and blame the BI team for everything. The reality is you have a data mesh, but because of all the friction in there, people don't think about it. It's not apparent to people that you have this mesh of data moving around your organization. So let's take a look at what it takes to implement data reuse based on this model. So here's the model. We'll look at each of these pieces in more detail. We start with how to build an individual reusable data asset. Then we're going to discover how to treat each data construct as a product along every stage of the organization throughout that mesh. And thirdly, we're going to figure out where in the process we can spell out the requirements of our product or verify the quality, inspect things, the kinds of things that we want to do to ensure that the supply and the flow of data through that organization is of the high quality that we want so that we can have data reuse. So this is the model that we're going to start with. Again, this is the conceptual model. And then once we've talked about the concepts, then we'll look at how those apply in Power BI and specifically list the ways to implement this as best practices. But I want to make sure that before we dive into the specifics, we understand the conceptual model. So step one, data reuse requires designing usable data products. The biggest hurdle to data reuse in practice, and this is true for any of the organizations that we've worked with here at Centrix, the usability of the data assets that we produce in the first place. The right data might be hard to discover. It might be hard to understand once discovered. The metrics or the measures that you've created might be hard to work with, or they're only valuable when combined with specific lookup data that only the team that created that report knows where that lookup data can be found, or those mapping tables. Maybe it changes so frequently that it's hard to trust. And so if it's hard to trust a data product, people aren't going to have the ability or the patience to try to reuse it unless they're really desperate. So the solution is to think of data not as a byproduct of the systems in your organization, right? People tend to think of our ERP system or our, in the healthcare space, maybe our EHR system. And people tend to think of those as the systems that produce things, and data is just sort of a byproduct. It's the thing that you get when you look into the database behind the system. But the solution here, in order to achieve data reuse, is to actually think of the data as a carefully designed product. Data has its own customers within your organization, maybe even outside. Data has its own product development lifecycle. Data has its own marketing needs. Data has its own customer satisfaction measurements. And these are all pulled from the data mesh book that I referenced earlier. Let me just take a quick look at an example of a product here that has had some work done on it to try to make the measures meaningful and discoverable for people to reuse in different contexts. So you've got the dashboard on the left. I'm not so interested in the visualizations here, not just because this is outdated COVID data, but because what I really want to focus on is the work that went into the model. So you've got measures here that are written in such a way that the average person can understand and access them. There's not necessarily database or data source specific naming of fields or tables in here. In fact, you won't really find any references to tables or fields at all here. What you're finding is things that are optimized for a self-service user to work with and to reconfigure and build their own dashboards, their own visuals, ask their own questions using Q&A. So that's what we're after. In this book on data mesh, Zhamak Dehghani proposed that data products have these 8 attributes, and she apologized for the terrible acronym here of .nivs, but it's a helpful thing to remember. These are the characteristics that in the real world make a product useful and usable. and specifically a data product. Now, without going into detail on each one of these, I recommend that you read the book or check out some of the blog posts on data mesh if you're interested in that. It's worth noting that several of these pieces are provided by Power BI as a platform. Discovery, we'll get into that more later, but the ability to address a data product and connect with it through standard protocols, the ability to work with the native tooling that Power BI provides, and especially the ability for data products to interoperate with each other. Now, if you haven't watched the previous webinar that we did on the pitfalls around data reuse, I recommend going back and watching that one, especially for some of these topics, to make sure that you actually are able to realize these capabilities with your data sets and with your data products. But for now, suffice it to say that the platform gives you some of these, but you as the architect or the leader, the strategist in your organization, you have to ensure that the rest of them are met. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So with that said, with data being a product, if you properly design your data assets and take advantage of the platform, then you can satisfy these requirements. So that's step one, is to think of data as a product, not a byproduct. Okay, so we understand that. What about this next point here? The type of reuse to design for depends on the data product domain. What is a data product domain? What are we talking about? So remember that supply chain analogy. Every part of your organization is producing data products, whether they know it or not. The pain comes from not understanding how data flows through an organization. Data product domains are not, they're not all the same. Fundamentally, they're going to be separated by a couple of shared characteristics, and we'll look at that here. So let's look at an example to start with. Let's take the example of a hospital. The hospital might have a finance department, they might have an operations department. And each of those has their own data sources. So finance might have an accounting system, maybe multiple accounting systems. Operations, you might have your EHR system here, your electronic health records. You might have other databases related to the operations of the hospital. Each of these domains then is creating their own data products. The finance team might be creating a data product to look at per patient revenue. The operations team might be creating a data product to look at length of stay data from the EHR system. Now, that data by itself is interesting, but other people are going to be interested in aggregating those together. So you might have a quality team that takes your per patient revenue and the length of stay from the EHR system, and they combine it into a, for example, a net patient revenue per adjusted patient day is a common operational metric that hospital systems look at. And so now you have this team that, among other things, is involved in analyzing overall effectiveness of quality of care and things like that. And so they're producing a data set that depends on other data assets, other data products that you've created across the organization. And now we get to end user facing reports. So you might have two different teams that are using this data for different purposes. The billing team maybe is combining this, the net patient revenue per adjusted patient day metric that quality created. They're maybe combining that with revenue cycle information to look at where we can target improvements for billing purposes. Whereas the clinical team might be taking in case mix data from the operations that's exposed as a separate data product and combine that with this metric to look at how case mix severity is impacting our ability to not only generate revenue, but maybe have cost-effective stays for patients as well. So you're seeing different teams in an organization, in this case a hospital, that are reusing data across them. So we can take a step back from the specifics of the hospital and look at what are the common characteristics of these domains. So here I've labeled them with this color coding of source, aggregate, and consumer. And that's really based on the way that data is flowing through. Of course, sometimes you're going to find, for example, the billing team will actually provide data back to finance to help give them maybe some forecasts or projections on aging of accounts or things like that. But the fact is that might happen at the team level, but at the individual data product level, you still have these consistent rules where data products are either source aligned, or they're aggregates, or they're consumer aligned. So we can get rid of some of the specifics again of the hospital example and just kind of fade that away and look at how data flows through an organization. And now this could be any organization, right? This could be a manufacturing plant. This could be a multinational corporation. This could be any number of types of customers of Power BI. And now, instead of having the 2 yellow domains, the 1 pink and the 2 red, let's just abstract away the number of teams as well and go one step further. And just let's view this as a horizontal spectrum where we have the source domains on the left, the aggregate domains in the middle, and the consumer data product domains on the right. So as you can see, data reuse is happening all along the way. What changes is the type of data reuse. On the left side, you tend to be doing more of the data engineering type of activities, whereas on the right side, it tends to be a lot more self-service driven. So what we want to do in Power BI is take advantage of the fact that this is how data reuse in an organization works when it's done correctly, and design our data products to that. Okay, so that was part 2 of our conceptual model. Let's take a quick look at part 3, which is how we actually get an organization to make these changes, to actually implement these changes.
So Lars, sorry to interject a little bit, but if you can go back to that previous slide, I think when someone looks at this slide, they may think that, this is the traditional sourcing from a data warehouse and then doing data modeling and then serving a dashboard or a report to an audience. But what we are talking about here is beyond that model. As you pointed out, each area in the organization is functioning as a creator, as a producer of data. So they, in their own process, have different data sources. It may not be a data warehouse, right? It doesn't have to be. The source can be another product that another area created, and then they add to it and create their own product. So this is not your traditional data warehouse, data modeling, and a report. It is at a macro level of creating data products.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really the key, is this is decentralized, right? There's not one central structure of one funnel that every piece of data in the organization flows through, which is great for a marketing demo for a data warehouse vendor, for example. But it's not really great in reality. And we've all seen that, where the BI team is just overloaded because everyone's trying to funnel everything through them. So this third point is really about the fact that if you have a decentralized set of data product domains, right? If you're after data products that are reusable and you recognize the fact that these data products are going to be decentralized across your organization, how do you make change happen? How do you actually implement this? If you're saying this will be decentralized, how do you, as maybe the leader of a BI team or someone who has influence there, how do you as a strategist make change happen in a decentralized way? So we're going to talk about leverage points. And leverage points, everybody understands the idea of a lever, right? The old adage of, give me a lever long enough and the right place to put it, and I can, lift the earth off of its base, basically, is the old joke. So if you take the concepts that we've talked about and say, okay, in reality, an organization has lots of different goals, lots of different agendas. Even your developers on your BI team, if you're the leader of a BI team, every one of them has their own priorities and their own list of to-do items. How do you effectively institute this idea that you want these data product attributes that we talked about before? How do you do that and scale that out and decentralize that? And the only way to do it is to look at places where you can have the most impact on the process. And there's a couple places. And this is going to be the general view of this, and then in a little bit we'll talk about where you do this specifically in Power BI. So the first place that you can have an impact is requests. So this one's pretty easy to understand. When a request comes in, typically a request is going to come from one of those consumer-aligned domains, right? Somebody says, I want this dashboard. Just give me this dashboard. That's all that they've thought about. They haven't thought about a data mesh. They haven't thought about source aligned or aggregate or consumer aligned data products or any of that. They just say, I need a report. I need these slicers. Please give it to me. This is your first opportunity as a strategist, as a leader, to push back in an effective way. And you might not have to do this overtly, but you can do this by deciding how you're going to implement that request. What you're going to do is say, well, is this, it's a consumer aligned dashboard maybe, but is that the only data product involved here? Is there maybe some data that should be pulled from a data source in a source aligned domain that we're going to make reusable? We'll talk about how to do that in Power BI in a little bit, but is there maybe something that we want to pull out here that's reusable for other teams? Is there maybe a shared model that multiple people will benefit from that's aggregating from different places? Those are the kinds of decisions you can make at the request stage. So we'll talk about that more. The next stage is design reviews, where you can proactively, as a leader, as somebody who has worked with Power BI, is familiar with Power BI, especially, you can have an impact here on the day-to-day development that your team is doing by saying, let's take a look at this work that's being done, ideally as early in the development process as possible, and make sure that we're implementing some of these best practices, these data product attributes. Are we designing things in a way that is reusable? Endorsements is the next stage and probably the last place where you can have a really meaningful impact yourself. And that is to figure out how you're going to apply a checklist or a review process to allow people to have their data product to be endorsed in a certain way. We'll talk about ways to do that later on. And then discovery is kind of the end result of this, is that are people able to find the data product that you want them to find? Are they able to do the discovery work that you want them to be able to do confidently? All right, so that's the theory. Let's now answer the question of how we apply this rather abstract model in Power BI, because this model could apply, and in fact it does apply whether you're using big data products like Databricks, or maybe you're doing all of your work in Snowflake. Today we're talking about Power BI and the fact that in Power BI you can actually implement this kind of a model for your organization. Now, if you look up best practices for Power BI, you will eventually come across these best practice diagrams that Microsoft has published. This is part of a larger collection. There's at least 16 of these on the Microsoft website that try to address the guidance we're looking at today. And Microsoft's guidance continually stresses data reuse, but unfortunately, it's very scenario based, and you're very quickly overwhelmed by saying, okay, but I don't have all of these pieces in exactly the same places that they are talking about. What matters, what doesn't matter. You are going to find not only that this is overwhelming, but often it's going to be contradictory between different scenarios. The reality is that the Microsoft documentation on this stuff generally is written to try to sell Power BI to a specific scenario and say, yes, Power BI can do X, Y, or Z, maybe advanced data preparation or something like that. But that is not a best practice model that you can actually follow in an organization. So let's distill everything down, the Microsoft best practices, the conceptual model, and look at how we implement data reuse in Power BI. The first step is to talk about those 3 tiers and map them to what we can actually build in Power BI. So we've got our source aligned tier, we've got our aggregating tier, and then we've got our consumer aligned tier. The first one, the source aligned tier, this is where you're going to be building data flows, and in some cases, direct query data sets. So the goal in this tier is secure, standardized, and scalable access to data. That's the overriding concern in the source aligned tier. If you are creating source aligned data products, you're trying to give people access to data. So what you're going to do in this tier is focus on data flows, focus on if data flows aren't meeting your needs, and in some rare cases you have to have up to the minute data rather than data that can use data flows with scheduled refresh, then yes, you can use direct query as well. But that's how you're going to want to get data into Power BI. Now, this isn't going to cover every possible use case, but 9 times out of 10, this is the pattern you want to follow. Get data into Power BI using data flows, and in some cases, direct query where you need to. The output of these data products in the tier 1 source aligned data product domain is workspaces. So data flows and direct query data sets, you can't publish those as an app in Power BI. You have to publish them as a workspace. So this is really focused on a data engineering audience. This is not about self-service customers necessarily. So you're going to need to provide some external documentation because, again, data sets can be documented in Power BI. Data flows, very, very limited ways that it can be documented. And so you're going to probably need some external documentation here. So this is like data dictionaries and things like that. So that's your source aligned tier. So that's the first place to start with data product development. The next is to look at the shared models that bring value to the organization. So in your aggregating tier, this is where you start to really focus on data sets. Now, typically, we're going to recommend import wherever possible, but of course, with both data flows and these direct query data sets, you can reference them using direct query as well. The other interesting thing to note here is data marts. This is the tier that data marts, the relatively newer member of the Power BI family, fall into. And data marts are interesting because in some ways they combine tier 1 and tier 2 into a single data asset. And those are nice for especially the smaller kind of self-service driven teams that don't necessarily have a data engineer on their team, but they know enough SQL to get by, and so they can expose, the results of some SQL queries in a data product, in a data set, but maybe they also want to do direct SQL queries against that. So data marts are useful for that. Again, the goal here is reusable models that serve the entire organization. So in the first tier, we're looking at access to data. In the second tier, we're looking at reusable models. These we are going to be publishing as apps. And so you're going to have some kind of a report here, even if it's just a very generic, like here's some example ways of using the measures that are in this data set, that kind of a report. Paginated reports, might also live in this space. And you're going to want to provide some usage guidance for power users of how to take advantage of this, because this leads very naturally to our third and final tier, and that is the self-service tier. So here we've got models and reports that are tuned for self-service BI. This is the 80%, 90% of your organization that are not Power BI power users, but also the ones who really want to answer questions, maybe using Q&A, maybe using filters and slicers. And so here you've got reports, and in some cases, maybe some specialized data sets to meet a particular consumer need. And again, here you're publishing apps, but the difference here is that here you're letting people share those apps in more of a self-service way. You're opening them up to a lot more tweaking, modifying, whereas in tier 2, maybe you're not necessarily opening things up for quite the same level of self-service tweaking. And the work here prioritizes data visualization and storytelling. So to recap, in tier 1, the effort goes into data engineering, SQL, Power Query, depending on the tool that you're using. Tier 2, the effort goes into usage guidance, and that includes designing your measures to be user-friendly. It includes making your tables and field names friendly for not just pro users or power users, but also for Q&A, thinking about synonyms, thinking about field descriptions, table descriptions, measure descriptions, all the types of things that we generally ignore when we're just focused on building a dashboard for a consumer. So these data sets really are richly annotated. There's a lot of work that goes into giving the power users the hints that they need to be able to use different data sets confidently. So for example, if you're using measure tables, are you using those consistently across the different tier 2 data sets that you have in your organization? So people generally know where to go to find the appropriate measures and columns and things like that. And then tier 3 is really where the data visualization and storytelling occurs. So that's the overall outline here. Now, what's interesting is, like we said before, this is based on a conceptual model that really applies to any technology where people can do self-service data reuse, not just Power BI. And so you might have, if you've done some reading, you might have looked into things like data lakehouse architectures, and you might have seen the bronze, silver, gold model for preparing data in a data lake. Well, this maps very naturally to that sort of metal tier model, where tier 1 is your bronze tier, tier 2 is your silver tier, and tier 3 is your gold tier. So for those of you who have looked into data lakehouse and you're trying to figure out, can I do data lakehouse in Power BI? The answer is absolutely yes. This is how you do it. All right, I forgot to remind people that we do have the Q&A feature in this webinar, so I should pause here for a moment. If there are any questions, feel free to throw those into the Q&A. But I will go ahead and continue with the next part of our model, which is how to actually make these changes happen in Power BI. What are the best practices for implementing this sort of an architecture in your organization with Power BI? So we've talked about this before, this idea of leverage points. So these are the leverage points specifically that you will find when working with Power BI. We've got report requests all the way through discoverability on the far right. Now, in a real organization, to inspire change, well, you can take one of two approaches. You can inspire change by selling people on it, or you can try to enforce change by dictating it. So you can either sell it, meaning you can provide some value to the person you're trying to sell your concept to in exchange for getting what you want out of them, or you can dictate change, meaning you can threaten punishment if they don't comply. We're going to assume that you're not able to dictate change because in reality you almost never can. So how do we sell Power BI data reusability? How do we sell the data reuse vision at each of these 5 leverage points? So here's how we do that. The first one is the report request. This is the best place to intercept data products before development on a request begins, is to have a well-defined report request funnel, especially if you are still operating in that central BI team sort of mode that most organizations still find themselves in. You don't have embedded, BI analysts or data engineers with the different domain-oriented teams in your organization. HR doesn't have their own analysts producing data assets. It's all still kind of funneled through a centralized BI team. So in that model, you have the advantage that you can create a central report request funnel. And this doesn't have to be anything fancy. You can use, SharePoint lists or Microsoft Teams lists, or even a planner board in Teams. And you can encourage people to submit requests through Microsoft Forms or through some other tool like that. And as you triage these requests and prioritize them and assign them to the appropriate developer, this is your opportunity to establish these data product attributes from the outset before the development on this request begins. So I talked about this before. You want to make sure that you're aligning to the right data product domain types. So going back to the slide here, you want to maybe break this report request into, certainly there's going to be some kind of a tier 3 report, maybe multiple, but are there some data sets that we want to make organizationally reusable? And what are the data sources that we can expose as tier 1 source aligned data product in maybe a reusable way? So that's your first leverage point. Now, we talked about selling. So how do you sell a report being changed from what the person requested to now being broken out into maybe 2 or 3 different pieces? Well, you're going to have to sell people on the fact that it's going to take a little bit more time to do this right the first time. But what are the benefits that they will get? Shorter turnaround for changes, because changes are much easier when things are modular and reusable. And sell people on the tooling capabilities of Power BI. If you want people to buy into your self-service vision that you have for this data reusability, then sell them on being able to create their own dashboards that are mobile optimized that they can pull out and look at their key statistics. Sell them on Q&A. Show them examples of how you've added the right synonyms and things to a model maybe to enrich it for Q&A. And then they will see the benefit of being able to have that and not just the list of 20 or 30 slicers that people tend to include in their report requests. So that was leverage point number 1. Leverage point number 2, here's the one not to do, and that is change management. Most organizations have some sort of a change management process where before an update to a report goes live into, say, production, that there is a set of checklists that you have to follow. Usually this includes, has somebody else tested this? Have we done a code review? Have we done a security review if anything changes? Have we identified the right time to make this change so that we're not disrupting users? That's what change management does. Change management is about ensuring stability. That is not a good place to do any kind of data reusability, driving towards data reusability in your organization. So if you have authority over the change management process, do not touch it. Don't put in an additional step saying, is this data product reusable? Because at this point, it's too late anyways. The work has already been done to develop that report, or maybe that data set or that data flow. And so you're just going to be seen as an artificial barrier, and we don't want that. Instead, look at a proactive way of implementing data reusability, and that is the design review. A design review is something that many teams already do. And if you're not doing it yet, this is a fantastic way to start distilling Power BI best practices to your team. So the things that we talked about earlier about how to break up data products into the different tiers, to bring them from tier 1, the source aligned, to tier 2 the aggregating, and tier 3 the consumer aligned. The best place to actually make that happen in practice, if you haven't already gotten people on board in the report request stage, is the design review. Because in the design review, you can offer some value. You can help people solve problems that they have with their report in exchange for getting what you want, which is to say, we've solved your problem of how to maybe, figure out this DAX measure that wasn't quite calculated correctly. Now, can we take a step back, and before you keep working on this report, which looks great, can you take the data sources and pull them into a data flow? And maybe you just start there. Encourage people to pull the data out into a data flow that is in a separate workspace that is reusable across different data products. So take baby steps, but design reviews are a fantastic place to inject best practices. The next is the promotion review. Now, in Power BI, there are two different types of endorsement. If you haven't already worked with endorsements, I recommend that you take a look at some of our previous webinars here in the Power BI Pulse series on data reuse, because we do talk about them. But there is basically promotion, which is decentralized, and certification, which is a centralized process. Promotion is something that anybody with the appropriate level of access to a workspace can do. They can mark a data product as promoted for the organization. And so here, you can provide value to those power users who are going to be promoting their data products by just training them on the benefits of a best practice checklist. So develop something that you think the average power user is able to follow, maybe some naming guidance on tables, maybe some guidance on how to follow a consistent template even, so that people's reports look and feel similar. And give some guidance even on how to reuse other data products that are maybe already out there. So those are things that you can put into a very straightforward checklist, train people on that checklist, offer an internal webinar, and then say, now that you're armed with this information, now you can go ahead and start promoting your data products once they adhere to this checklist. So this is a scale out process. It's not tightly controlled, and it's not designed to be tightly controlled. It's designed to be something that gets your power users to be advocates for data reuse. On the other hand, certification is a centralized process. In the Power BI admin settings, you can restrict who can certify data products to specific groups of people. And this is where you can therefore get the highest value, highest impact changes to happen. And the way to do that is to, again, you have to sell a benefit in exchange for what you want. So what you're selling with the certification review is letting people know this is the most exclusive status. If you want your data product to be part of what we talk about with our executives, if you want your data product to be part of what we show in the company-wide demos or on the, the intranet site homepage where we're introducing people to Power BI, if you want it to be part of what we use in our internal Power BI training, you're going to have to be certified, not just promoted, not just have a design review, but you actually have to go through our certification review. And therefore, by showing people the value of what a certified data product gives them, you're incentivizing them to say, okay, I'm going to put in the extra work. I wasn't planning on doing these different things that the data reuse checklist calls for, splitting it out into separate workspaces, separate models, things like that. But because I want that certification badge, I'm going to go through that extra effort. So the certification review is a high impact leverage point, but it also requires a lot of selling to make sure that people understand the benefit of the certification review. Okay, our last point of how to implement data reuse effectively at scale in Power BI has to do with the discoverability of data once it's in Power BI. Again, we saw the kind of chaotic homepage earlier. What a lot of organizations haven't even begun to start to look at is the data hub. The data hub is what Microsoft has been pitching for a while now as the place to go if you want to do data self-service, if you want to build your own self-service reports or hybrid data sets off of other data sources in the organization, go to the data hub. But what does the data hub look like? This is a screenshot from our demo tenant. And there's a couple things that hopefully stand out to you when you look at the data hub. The first is almost all of these things look identical, right? The icons, they're all just the data set icon here. So there's very little to visually differentiate them. What is the one data product that actually stands out? It's this one. It's the one that has a carefully designed icon that tries to convey a little bit more about what this data product represents. So icons are immensely useful for branding in Power BI. for workspaces, for apps. And so use them consistently. And you probably also want to monitor their use. If you have the ability to, on a monthly basis, review what data products are out there and make sure that if you have a consistent visual language of data products, and maybe you've got an organizational color scheme where maybe a blue background is for the certified and trusted ones, a green background is maybe for more generic promoted ones. And anybody who's just doing their own kind of thing, they're not allowed to use one of those reserved colors. Maybe those are standard brand colors for you. Make sure you monitor that. Make sure you're consistent. So in addition to the icon, what else actually gives people any kind of insight on this slide into what these data products are? There are data set descriptions, but as you'll notice, they're hidden behind a little drop down. They're very small font, and that's only visible if you actually click on the drop down. So look at the names. The names, both of the data set and of the workspace that they come from, their location. Those names are a primary piece of information. So spend time on naming, focus on intuitive naming. If you look at even the search capability, if you look for metrics or measures or visual titles, you will find some relevant search results, but look at the search result. There's nothing here about revenue in any of these. Now, there is a revenue metric in the medical visits data set here, but it's not clear to me as a person doing a search in Power BI why these things are connected. So spend time on intuitive naming. And then ultimately, as your adoption of Power BI grows, you're going to need a way to guide people to the content they're looking for. We're going to have more on that in a future webinar. I think just given the time that we have left here, I think we want to conclude and leave time for Q&A. But we at Syntrix have actually developed a product called Eureka that is a business intelligence catalog that allows you to have an inventory of not just reports and data sets like what you're seeing here in Power BI, but your actual metrics, the actual measures that you're able to identify across different reports. So like this search that I was trying to do here to say, show me reports that have to do with revenue. You can't do that in Power BI. You can do that in our Eureka platform. So with that, and we might actually have time for me to pull up a demo. Let me see if I can change the screen that I'm sharing here. Give me just a moment to sign into that. I'm going to pause sharing, and yeah, we'll switch over to the demo. All right. So what we've got here is a dashboard. Now, this is an older version of the Eureka system. But this is a dashboard that allows you to view all of the different reports in your environment, but we can actually filter by different tags, different metrics. So if we want to look at things that are related to readmission or related to surgery, we can do that. And we can look at, maybe the emergency department arrivals metric is something that I'm interested in. And maybe I'm not even familiar with all the things that are in Power BI, but I know that I'm looking for data related to this topic. So we've documented these reports inside of the Eureka platform, and we're making them available to users to view here. So this is, again, an older version of this product. We have an updated demo of this that will be coming in a future webinar. But this is an example of the types of things that you unfortunately can't do in Power BI natively, but that you can do with Eureka. So with that, let me jump back to the slides here. And let's see if we can resume from where we left off here. So that was our discoverability with the data hubs or with the Power BI data hub and with Eureka as a comparison. And now let's turn it back over to Jean-Luc to wrap things up.
Thank you very much, Lars. I just want to reflect back on what we said at the beginning, that this session was not so much for the data engineer, but for the BI strategist. And I like this quote from Peter Drucker saying that culture eats strategy for breakfast, meaning that you can have the best strategy, but if the organization culture it resists these things, there is no way your strategy will work. And I like how you were bringing up that the levers that we have are ways to sell and to get buying from people to really see the value in reusing data products, creating data products, and sharing data products. So as much as we can influence culture, we will be successful, right? So culture, a culture that favors, decentralization, right, is comfortable with delegated authority, for instance, is conducive to reusing data. But a culture that says, I have the monopoly on anything data related is not going to be conducive to reusing data, and you'll fall back to the old overwhelming one team to create everything scenario. So very much you are a cultural influencer, and try to promote a culture that will make this easy. So with that, we have come to the conclusion of this series. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the Q&A box, and we'll give you a few seconds for that.
While you're thinking about questions, it's worth highlighting also that all of the information that we had in this webinar, as well as information from some of the previous webinars, we will be compiling or have been compiling into an ebook that will be coming soon. So if you actually joined this webinar, thank you for doing that, and we will be letting people know via email when that is available. If you're watching the recording of this later, make sure that on our Power BI Pulse page, the URL is here on the screen, that you sign up for our newsletter so that you can be notified when that ebook is available.
I don't see any questions come through, Lars, so it looks like you did such a great job that everything is clear.
Wouldn't that be nice?
Yeah. Well, thanks for the kudos, and thank you all for joining today, and see you in our next Power BI Pulse.
Thank you very much.